Two sets of tires left a Ferrari garage electronically and never came back physically. And by Friday evening at Spa-Francorchamps, that single administrative gap had both of Ferrari's cars sitting in front of the stewards. Not for pace, not for a crash, for paperwork. The question hanging over the Belgian Grand Prix weekend is a strange one. How does a team fighting for wins misplace something as basic as a tire return? And what does that gap actually say about what's happening inside the Scuderia right now, on the exact weekend it needs to look sharpest? It's a small story on the surface. It doesn't stay small once you start pulling at it. And by the time the steward's summons went out on Friday evening, half the paddock was already asking the same question out loud. A team built around precision, chasing two rivals at once, had just failed at something almost mechanically simple, and simple failures are usually the ones worth asking harder questions about. This isn't a story about a car being too slow, or a strategy call going wrong on the pit wall. It's a story about a process, the unglamorous kind that never makes a highlight reel, breaking down on both sides of a championship-contending garage at the exact same time. Reportedly, this wasn't a single oversight. It was the same mistake, made twice, on both sides of the garage, for Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, on the same day, in the same session, hours apart from each other. That repetition is what turns a clerical footnote into a real question. If it happens once, it's a mistake. If it happens on both cars, at the same track, in the same window of time, you have to ask whether it's a symptom of something bigger inside a team currently chasing Mercedes and Red Bull with everything it has. Put another way, is this a one-off slip from a tired mechanic on a long Friday, or a crack in a process that's supposed to be airtight for a team fighting on every front at once, on track and off it? That's the question this story keeps circling back to, in slightly different words, every few minutes, and it's worth sitting with before reaching for an answer too quickly, because the answer changes depending on how deep you're willing to look. Either way, the identical nature of the failure on both cars is the detail doing most of the work in this story, and it's the detail that kept this from being dismissed as a one-line footnote in Friday's timing sheets. According to the FIA's own paperwork, the mechanism at the center of this is Article B6.4.2 of the sporting regulations, the rule governing how tires move between a team and Pirelli, the sport's sole tire supplier. Under this rule, a team can log a tire set back to Pirelli electronically once a session ends, but that digital log has to be matched by the tires physically arriving at the tire supplier's garage before the next session begins. It's a two-part handshake, built deliberately that way. Confirm it on paper, then confirm it in person. Miss either half, and the rule is broken regardless of intent, regardless of whether anyone in the garage meant anything by it at all. There's more sitting underneath that rule than a simple box-ticking exercise, though, and that's worth unpacking properly before going any further into how this actually played out on Friday afternoon at one of the most demanding circuits on the calendar. Here's what that rule is actually protecting, and it's not as dull as it sounds once you understand why it exists in the first place. Pirelli allocates tire sets under a strict published system for every driver, every weekend, and the whole point is to stop any team quietly holding on to extra rubber it shouldn't have access to during a session it's not supposed to have it for. The electronic return starts the clock. The physical return closes it. Joe Bauer, the FIA's Formula One technical delegate, logged the specifics precisely. Two sets of dry-weather tires for car 16, Leclerc, and an identical pair for car 44 Hamilton, all returned electronically, in line with the usual protocol, immediately after FP1 concluded. But the corresponding physical sets, according to Bauer's report, never made it back to the appointed tire supplier for FP2 got underway later that same afternoon. The mismatch was immediate and undeniable in the FIA's own log, and it triggered a formal report rather than a quiet word passed between garages behind the scenes. Bauer's language in the report was clinical and specific, citing the exact tire set numbers involved for each car and the precise articles of the regulations they related to, leaving no ambiguity about what had and hadn't happened between the two sessions. Now put a number on what that mismatch actually cost, because it's smaller than the noise around it suggests once the paperwork was finished. A Ferrari team representative was required to report to the stewards at 19:10 local time, and by the end of that hearing, the outcome was straightforward. The stewards fined Ferrari €10,000 in total, €5,000 for each car, after hearing directly from the team's representative in person. The statement attached to Hamilton's case reads plainly, "The team representative acknowledged the breach and attributed it to an oversight." An identical report, almost word for word, was filed separately for Leclerc's side of the garage. No steward's argument, no contest, no mitigating defense mounted on either side, just a straightforward admission followed by a bill. On paper, that should have been the entire story, filed away by Saturday morning without much more said about it either way. €10,000 is a rounding error against the budget of a team competing at Ferrari's level, and the steward's language, brief and procedural, gave no indication they viewed this as anything beyond a straightforward lapse in process. Spa-Francorchamps runs longer and busier practice sessions than almost any other venue on the schedule, with tighter turnarounds between them, and that timing pressure is exactly the kind of environment where a two-part procedural rule like this one gets tested hardest. But that number alone doesn't fully explain why this got as much attention as it did trackside while the hearing was still underway. Sky Sports pundit Bernie Collins, live on air before the verdict landed, reportedly raised the possibility of something heavier than a fine, pointing to a past case involving her former team, Aston Martin, where a similar tire return mix-up had resulted in a one-place grid penalty rather than just a financial hit. That comparison is what turned a quiet admin note into a genuine watch-and-wait moment for anyone following the session live, because a grid penalty at Spa, on a track where track position is close to everything, would have mattered a great deal more to both championship contenders than any fine ever could, no matter how large the number attached to it. It's the kind of comment that spreads fast in a paddock already primed to look for cracks in a team on a hot streak. And reportedly, it did exactly that, within minutes of going out on air. So here's the honest counter-argument, and it deserves real weight rather than a quick dismissal in either direction. History overwhelmingly favors the fine, not the penalty. Tire return breaches of this kind, where the intent is clearly administrative rather than competitive, tend to be treated as procedural failures, not sporting advantages worth punishing on the grid itself. Nobody has suggested Ferrari gained a single tenth of lap time from holding onto tires a few hours too long. There is no whisper, confirmed or otherwise, that this was anything other than a logistics slip in a packed practice day at one of the busiest events on the calendar. Collins' comparison raised the stakes in the room for a moment, but it didn't ultimately change the substance of what actually happened once the stewards sat down with the facts in front of them, article by article, precedent by precedent, case by case. Grid penalties in this sport are typically reserved for breaches that touch performance directly, things like unapproved parts or technical infringements found on the car itself, not administrative timing slips in how equipment gets logged and moved between garages. And the substance, once the stewards ruled, turned out to be exactly what history predicted it would be. Ferrari was fined, not penalized on the grid. Hamilton and Leclerc keep their times from Friday untouched. Nothing changes on the timesheets, and nothing changes heading into qualifying. The paperwork gets closed out, the fine gets paid, and both cars roll into Saturday exactly where their pace put them, with the stewards' room now behind them, rather than ahead of them, going into the weekend that actually counts for points and positions. For a story that briefly carried the shape of genuine jeopardy, the actual outcome is almost anticlimactic, which is exactly why the more interesting version of this story sits elsewhere, away from the verdict itself. Which brings the story back to the people actually driving these cars, because a €10,000 admin fine means very little on its own, sitting in isolation from everything else happening around it this weekend. What it does is put a spotlight, however briefly, on a Ferrari garage that is supposed to be operating at its sharpest right now, mid-season, mid-fight, with both cars inside the top three in Friday's opening practice, behind only Max Verstappen's Red Bull. Hamilton arrives in Belgium sitting second in the Drivers' Championship, carrying real momentum after his first win in red at the Spanish Grand Prix earlier this year, a result that reset how the entire paddock talks about him this season. Leclerc, meanwhile, is the man who spent years being the one Ferrari built its cars around, now sharing a garage with a seven-time champion who is suddenly winning in his colors on home soil for the team. A tire mix-up on both sides of that garage, on the exact same day, lands differently against that backdrop than it would for a struggling midfield team, with nothing left to lose, and no pressure weighing on either side of the pit wall. Every small mistake made by a team this visible gets read as a signal, fairly or not, simply because of who's watching and what's riding on the next few races. There's a deeper layer worth pulling at here too, one that has nothing to do with tires directly, but everything to do with why a small mistake reads as a bigger story right now. Ahead of the Spanish Grand Prix, it emerged that Hamilton had quietly switched to Carbone Industrie brake discs, the same supplier he used through his most dominant seasons at Mercedes, moving away from Ferrari's decades-long partner Brembo, a relationship spanning more than 50 years of shared history in the sport. Leclerc reportedly followed him into the same switch shortly afterward, having complained about brake feel of his own in recent races before that point. Ferrari has stated this change hasn't damaged its relationship with Brembo, but the timing tells its own quiet story, regardless of what's said publicly about it. This is a team actively rewriting parts of its own technical identity in the middle of a title fight, and rewrites, even successful ones, tend to create friction somewhere in the process, whether that friction ever becomes visible to the outside world or not. Two drivers changing a core mechanical component mid-season, in pursuit of marginal gains they clearly believed were worth the disruption, is not a small decision for any team to absorb quietly. Friction like, perhaps, two identical clerical errors landing on both cars on the same Friday, at the same track, hours apart from one another. That's a connection worth naming honestly, and also one worth being careful with, because naming it isn't the same thing as proving it exists. There's no confirmed link between the brake supplier switch and Friday's tire return breach. One is a technical choice made weeks apart from the other, and one is a logistics failure inside a single practice session, separated by circumstance, and by time, and by the people actually responsible for each part of the operation. Suggesting they're the same story would be reaching further than the evidence currently allows anyone to reach. What can be said honestly is that Ferrari, right now, is a team making rapid internal changes while also fighting on track for every point available, and both of those threads are happening at once, in parallel, whether or not they ever actually touch each other in any meaningful way. Viewers looking for a tidy explanation connecting the two will have to wait for more evidence than currently exists, because right now, there simply isn't any. Zoom out to where this actually leaves the championship picture, because that's the part with real, current numbers attached to it, rather than speculation or paddock chatter. Ferrari has claimed 2 race victories so far this season, a return that's kept the team firmly inside the title conversation heading into the second half of the year. Hamilton's Barcelona win pushed him into second in the drivers' standings, a position he now has to defend every single weekend against Mercedes' Hakimi Antonelli, who topped Friday's second practice pace by a significant margin over the rest of the field at Spa. Hamilton finished FP2 fourth, 747 thousandths of a second off Antonelli's benchmark time. Leclerc slipped further back, down to 11th on the same timesheet, well outside the positions his pace in FP1 had suggested was possible for the rest of the weekend. Those are the numbers that actually decide races and championships, not the size of a fine handed down on a Friday evening in the steward's room. Every tenth of a second across a season adds up to positions gained or lost in the standings, and that arithmetic is what Ferrari's garage is actually being measured against this weekend, far more than any procedural note filed with the FIA. So walk back through what's confirmed and what isn't, because that distinction matters more here than it usually does in a story like this one. Confirmed. Ferrari breached Article B6.42 on both cars after FP1, on both sides of the garage, according to Joe Bauer's own written report to the stewards. Confirmed. The FIA fined the team €10,000 total, split evenly across both drivers, after a hearing held at 19:10 local time on Friday. Confirmed. No grid penalty was applied, and both drivers keep their Friday times fully intact heading into the rest of the weekend. Speculative, and only ever speculative, whether this reflects a wider operational strain inside Ferrari's garage right now, whether the brake supplier switch and this incident share any real connective tissue beneath the surface, and whether Bernie Collins' Aston Martin comparison would have mattered had the stewards read the case any differently on the day it actually happened. None of that speculation should be mistaken for the confirmed record, and none of it changes what the stewards actually decided once they'd heard from both sides of the garage. What isn't speculative is what comes next. Qualifying at Spa-Francorchamps is still ahead, run on a circuit where grid position translates directly into race result more than almost anywhere else on the calendar, and both Ferrari drivers arrive there having just admitted, on the record, to an oversight in front of the stewards less than 24 hours earlier. Whether that costs them anything beyond €5,000 each is a question only Saturday's session can actually answer, and whether the pattern behind it resurfaces somewhere else later this season is a question that will need its own answer in time. Nothing here is confirmed as a crisis, and nothing here should be read as one. It's a fine, a footnote, and an open question about a garage under more scrutiny than usual, heading into a qualifying hour that will say far more than Friday's paperwork ever could. That's exactly where this story, quietly, picks back up.